Okay, so we're going to look at how to create and set up render layers. So this is our project and let's call it done. So we've got some textures just slapped on. There's an HDR in there, just lighting the scene, so it's not perfect, but we'll just do this for the demonstration. And then we have some walls in there which are blank because I know these will not be in shot. So just to recap, this is our plate. So we've got the green screen areas, which are going to be the areas we want the CG, and this top area. It's all around there. That will be our CG. And then we have an asset on top of the plate, which will be the tankard. So the result in Maya is looking like this. So we've got the room on the left hand side. We have some assets in front and this tankard. There's a slight bit of ground plane, but I'll talk about that in a bit. Then we have the background going off there. So we're just going to start to do a few things to separate these. So first of all, what I would do is in my render settings, if you need to optimize your renders as well, this is advisable. We can start to add a few render passes. So we haven't separated anything, but I guess I should say the plan would be for these front assets, like the tankard, the sign, and these bits, I want them on a separate render layer. This room in the background, separate render layer. This wall and metal gate thingy, that could be on a separate render layer. Then I guess everything going back on a separate render layer. So we would have about 4. Actually, let's make it 3. So everything on the right, that'll be a separate one, because we'll include different IDs or probably just a crypto map, something like that. So when we're adding different render layers, we need to think, do we want to build this render from scratch in comp? So if that is the case, then in Arnold, we probably want to add in an albedo. That'll be our base color, and a specular. It would be cool to have specular direct and indirect, so to control the primary and then secondary rays of our reflections. Transmission, do we have glass in the scene? No, we don't, so we can ignore that, but same rules apply. You know, subsurface scattering, that sort of thing. We do want a Z pass, although I don't have a plane in the background. So if you want depth of field, you would need to put in some sort of polygon plane. This environment on the right hand side goes really far back, so we'd probably want to put it somewhere just past this barn and then turn off cast shadows and everything. So if you create a polygon plane and you want to do that for your depth of field, so I've just clicked on this one, you would need to go into the shape node and then go to render stats, turn off pretty much everything. You could leave double-sided on, but the reason for that is so we can actually, so the camera knows where the end of the scene will be. We just want the camera rays to hit this plane really, but not have any effect of anything else. So it will allow us to create this depth of field correctly. But I'll add it to the list. I'll do a test render. If there's nothing there, then that's what I'd need to do. We could render normals, but I don't think there are normals on any of these. So actually I'll leave that. And what else? If we have a bit of noise in the scene that isn't moving too much, we can add denoise beauty AOV, and this is a post process. So once it's rendered our beauty, then it will refine it after that. It will just try and clean it up. So we can leave that on, but again it costs more render time. And also it will end up smoothing the noise. So if I look at my render, I do have some noise here, but this isn't going to be in the render anyway, so that's fine. I think it's just this back bit, just down there. But I'm pretty sure, because that's quite a lot of noise, that's going to be visibly moving. If I look at my denoise that I added for that render, it pretty much blurs it all together, which looks fine, but because it's a fair amount of noise, I know that even with the denoise, it's going to have this weird looking effect because it's still, there are still all these pixels flickering about, and the denoise is just pretty much smoothing them. So it's still going to be noticeable. So I'm actually going to turn that off. So what else? So I've got the base color, pretty much albedo, specular, specular indirect. And let's just quickly take a look. Motion vector. If you want motion blur, you know, you can render that as well. That's pretty cool. I don't think it works with glass because of the refraction. So if you want motion blur and you've got glass in your scene, that's something to be aware of. But otherwise, motion vector, if you want to comp that pass in, that's a very quick way of doing motion blur. So where's the shadow? We want a shadow matte. I think I've just passed it. Shadow matte, there we go. And okay, that's fine. That's fine. I might, I'm going to do a render with these and just go through the passes, but I'm going to add in one more light as well, just to show you how you could set up light groups as well, because there is a weird glitch, well, kind of glitch in Arnold, so I might as well just record it and then show you how to fix the problem that will very likely come up.
One eternity later.
Okay, so now we're back. I've done a render. I've added a light, so as you can see it looks very amazing. Top-notch VFX. I've got the render passes, so we can look. There's the Z, as predicted. Not much is going on even when I change the gamma. So at the moment that's not usable. Brilliant. Let's go to albedo. So this is just all the base colors. As you can see, these areas are just gray. There's nothing on them. Looks terrible. Not useful. Not going to be rendered, so it doesn't matter. Shadow matte. As you can see, the shadows are white. Cool. You can kind of gather how you might be able, if you've used Nuke before, you can gather how you will isolate them from that. Specular, very noisy, terrible. Direct, so the main source of light and then the bounce are in the specular indirect. Cool, very noisy in that room. But looking at it, I would say it's too noisy. Like if I would need to put the samples up, I could try, actually I'm going to do light groups and then I'll re-render, because if you want to optimize a render, then you can actually isolate different lights, because you see this light over here is quite intense. So if we put up the samples that are produced with this light, then that could actually solve a lot of the problems. However, this scene is being lit by just an HDR, so that's quite expensive to render. So we could put the samples up in the HDR, or we could change the overall camera samples, the AA. Camera samples there, so that's a multiplier. The only thing I changed, so that's by default, that's on 3, so I can put that on 3. All these would be 2, otherwise I turn the subsurface to 0 and volume indirect to 0. This is for like fluid things, so let's forget about that. And the HDR, if you did want to turn up the samples for that, it would just be here, so it's on 1. I think that's the default one. I can't remember. My area light, yeah, okay, I just made that a minute ago. So the samples are 1 by default. So if we want to make light groups, what we want to do is go to different lights. The scene is a mess, as you can see in the outliner, but I've kind of borrowed it. But you should rename things. So let's call this light fire lights. Cool, I've named it here so it names the shape where we actually do the alterations. In the lights, if we scroll down, we have a few settings here. If you do want something visible to camera, you turn this to 1. By default in your HDR, I think this is turned to 1. So if you have the opposite problem in your HDR, you've got it in your background, then you want to turn that to 0, because then it will be in your alpha as well. Okay, let's change this name. So in order to have light groups, you need to give every light a name. So I'll call it fire. Go to my HDR. Let's rename this to HDR. Go to the shape. So my visibility in the camera is 0, so we're not seeing it. And the light group, call it HDR. Cool. If you want to add any shadowing, or if you want to create shadows but you don't want to add specific geometry for it, you can just add a certain filter in there. A little note about filters. Certain lights have other filters, so if you want to create sort of if you want to project certain like caustic type effects, I've got a video on cookie cutter lights. The Maya standard spotlight has extra filters that aren't with the Arnold lights. Not 100% sure why, but something to make note of. Okay, now jump back into the render settings. So we've given them a name. So now we want to pick the AOVs that render these extra passes, because for the lights, so now we've given them a light group, we now need to pick, okay, so do we want separate, because each time we're adding a light group to an AOV, it's creating some separate passes. So again, it's going to cost more time. So that's something to consider. So I would generally say you only want to do it for the speculars, but that's just me. Okay, so so I've clicked on the specular, and in this light groups, I can see I have a light called default. So I'm pretty sure that's one of these other lingering HDRs that have been copy and pasted across. So I'm just going to delete them. Yeah, okay, I'll just remove them. So on the specular, I'm going to click all light groups, and I want the same for the specular direct. So all light groups, you can see I've got fire and HDR. Otherwise, just type in the name there that you want. So all the different speculars, we will have 2 separate passes. So we'll get the beauty, then the fire, separate pass, and the HDR. This is really useful because when you're in comp and you're building up a render, you can literally you can do things like animate the lights, you know, stuff like that. It's pretty cool. It's just if you've got a lot of lights, it could be heavy for the compositor, but then again, if you're not the one comping, then I guess YOLO. Okay, something to keep in mind, if I try and hit render now, I will probably get an error, so maybe I should hit render and see what happens. Okay, I started to get a slight error at the bottom, so I'm just rendering just in case you get it. You might get something like this if you try and add a light group. So it says two drivers produce the same output path, AOV merging is only supported, blah, 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 whatever. Okay, so to fix this, we just need to, it's related to here. So it's talking about the driver. All we need to do is, if we still want an EXR pass to come out, we just need to change it from this default EXR to a fresh one. I guess this is the inbuilt default. And so when I go to render again, this should be all fine. So I'm just gonna hit render and see what comes out.
5 minutes later.
Okay, so the render is finished, and let's take a look, and lo and behold, everything is rendered out fine. So these extra AOVs, so let's take a look. So that was the default spec. Specular fire, so it's isolated that. Specular HDR. So you can see we're not actually getting much noise there. So another good reason for rendering these separately is if, so looking at this, we can see that we're getting a lot of noise with that particular light. So we could actually turn the samples up on that specific light. So then when it's comped in, there will be an addition. The compositor will like add these together, and then we can isolate that and remove the noise from it. So specular direct, this is what it looks like, and then spec direct fire, and then HDR, cool. So these all came out fine just from changing the standard EXR input just to EXR again. Not fully sure why, but it works. Okay, so that's done. Let's say, just saving. So now we can move on to actually separating these layers. Okay, before I continue, I might just, like this, there are certain things which you can add onto render layers. You can add overrides, but this geometry here, here, and here, so my ground plane and my shadowing walls, because of the plane, if you remember, we've put some of these objects in, like the ground and the wall, just for shadows, but we don't actually want them in the render. So before I continue, I might as well turn them off, essentially. So what I want to do is hide them, but keep the shadowing. So I can go to render stats, so click on this object, and click primary visibility. So as you can see, the object is still casting shadows, receiving shadows. Visible in reflections and refractions, this will come up later, because if you think about it, this is grey, this looks crap, but it's going to be visible in reflections and refractions, and this object down here is very shiny, so that applies for here as well. If we have a lot of objects that we need to change primary visibility on, then there's another way we could do that. We go to Windows, General Editors, and I think it's Attribute Spreadsheet. Let's take a look. I'm going to select another wall. As you can see, I get all these different inputs, and it would be in the Geometry tab. Sorry, I was lying. It would be in the Render tab. Primary Viz, okay, so it's there. I could just tap that and press 0. If you've got a whole list of objects, you just click on the top word and then type 0, and you'll change it en masse. I think you can also add subdivisions for rendering this way. If the Arnold tab's there, yep, somewhere. Subdiv iterations, cool, yeah. Anyway, that's something to keep to be aware of. So I've turned this off. So now, so you can see what I'm doing, I'm going to quickly do another render.
Many unbearable hours later.
Okay, so my render is just finished. So if I do before and after, you can see my walls are now gone, which is brilliant. But I have forgotten to do to turn off my plate, so my camera, for the lineup and layout. So when I go to alpha, it's just pure white, which is not useful. So I just need to change that. So if you need to do that yourself, you could just select your camera. So I'm viewing through my render cam, so I can go to view, select camera, scroll to my plate. So rename your files, and oh, actually I've got 2 in here. That's bad, I shouldn't do that. So I'll go to the one, this one is actually turned off. This was one that I added before the recording. Display mode, turn to none. So when I'm not going to re-render it, but just take my word for it, it won't be there. Have faith. Okay, I'm going to get out the camera view because now I want to separate these layers. So we go to Windows, Render Settings, Render Setup. So now we will put in our render layers here. So what we will do first is these objects in the front. We can create a new render layer. Sorry, I should do that. I'll just call this foreground. So for the front objects. Now we need to add things to it. So I'm going to right click, go to create collection. So I call it foreground geo. And then I could select all these objects and drag and drop. I'm just going to select them because there's only a few. Then click add. Cool. What else? So when I go to view, you can now see we have this on its own. The thing is, I need to add in other objects for any sort of reflections and light spill, because if I render this now, let's take a look actually, it's going to look different, and we don't want it to look different. It needs to look the same but just be separated. So now we're missing a lot. You can see how the light's changing. In fact, the lighting probably looks cooler on this particular asset, but that's not in a good way because it's different, so that's a problem. So we need to now add in other objects to affect these particular assets. So this wall, in fact, it's primarily looking at the scene. I think we just need this wall and the floor, because the reflections of the tankard, sorry, this is a really shiny tankard, so it's going to be reflecting the floor, the HDR, and anything around it. It will possibly be reflecting this ground as well, but we're not going to see it from that side. So what I'm going to do is create another collection. Actually, I don't want to put it there. That was a collection inside a collection, so I'm going to right click on here, do create collection. Let's call this shadow actually primary vis objects, just so I know what they're being used for. So I'm going to just select these assets and add them into this group. Now they already have primary visibility turned off, so when I render this it should look fine. But let's say I want to add in this ground, so maybe I'll do that as an example. So I've selected that, add that. So when I render this, these walls I predict will be invisible, and then we will have that. So it's in a separate collection, but it's still going to be rendered. We haven't told Maya to turn it off. Sorry, to hide it. We don't want it. We would like it to be in the reflection zone. Okay, so this is the render that came out. So this was up before, and then the after. So with this grounding, you can see we also have this light, this firelight, affecting the ground. And because we wanted this grounding for any potential reflections there, which is fine, but not only is the ground on, but it's inheriting more of this light than it was previously. If I compare it to what it should look like that. So we'd technically, like, if we wanted this to be all correct with the lighting, because I know this light should not be affecting the scene as much. If I go back to this render here, there's a bit of yellow light, and I know that this should not be spilling out into this the foreground objects. Because I know this, and I know that my render shouldn't look like this, I'm going to turn off primary visibility on this object, this ground, and then also create a layer override to turn this light off or to reduce its intensity. So I'm going to jump back to the render settings, render setup, in fact. So the primary visibility objects. So I added in the tiles concrete. Now I'm just going to select the tiles concrete, because these are the objects that I want primary visibility turned off. Then I can go to just any one of the objects, go to the attribute spreadsheet, and as you can see here it says drag attributes from attribute editor. So we can drag that across, and now the color has changed to be orange, so now we can turn off primary visibility. So when I re-render, the stones on the floor should not be there. What I do is, with my foreground layer visible, go to Windows, Render Editors, and Light Editor. So now we have the list of the lights in the scene, and we can then turn it off here. So we can do create absolute override for visible layer. You see it's created this. So now we can turn that light off. So when I go here, actually, self-enabled. Let's do a test render to see what's up with that.
A little later.
Cool. So now we've removed that light as well. So we have, so let's look. Whoops. So yeah, before and after essentially. Foreground, and then the original beauty render. So something to consider. We're getting some other shadowing from here, but for this example I'm going to leave it. But you can see there is a difference. We're getting some shadowing from another part. I believe there's another wall out of camera shot, but there's nothing on it, so it's giving us this what looks like black highlighted reflection. So I just need to add that extra wall into my primary vis layer that I created. So yeah, you can see there's nothing here, but there's if I changed to my other render layer, my primary one, you see there's a wall there. So it's this wall that is causing a weird, well, it's not weird, but we should probably need we need that in. So I should add that. I'll leave it for the moment, and let's create another render layer for the blacksmith room. Okay. Cool. So I've done that. Create collection. So we need to add the objects, then add the primary vis layers. So this is where organization comes into it. Like, is this stuff grouped or is it not? Let's take a look. No, it's not. Brilliant. Okay, so the stuff that is visible to camera, we want to add to this first collection. So this wall, okay, great. So I'm just going to quickly add this stuff, and then okay, so as people might have guessed, the base render layer, after adding the objects in, because there's nothing creating shadows, we just get that. So that's just something to be aware of, like as you're creating these layers, you just want to be careful, do it slowly. So I put in the objects, did a test render, just so I can see, right, these are the objects that I know are going to render for this layer. Then once you've done that, add to the next collection. So in this case, for the blacksmith room, I'm going to create my primary vis layer. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm just want to add everything that will contribute reflections, shadows, that sort of thing. So these walls, it's mainly just going to be these walls. Maybe the ground plane. In terms of reflections, we've got an anvil in there which has reflections. If I scaled up this ground plane, I would also add this in, because at some point I'm going to need to put texture on this ground plane because it's reflecting. These tankards are pretty shiny. But anyway, let's just double check. Okay, so I've selected that. Have I selected the back wall? Yep. Okay, so I'll add these in. Some of these objects have primary vis on, some of them do not, I think. Yeah, okay, 2 of them don't. So in my primary vis collection, I just went to any of the objects and went to primary vis, middle mouse, dragged and dropped. Then I go to this absolute override and turn it off there. So now when I re-render, I might as well do another re-render. Let's take a look. Oh, I'm not. Yeah, I need to go back to viewing that layer. So you will have to keep swapping between. Well, we can actually check before I render. Like, okay, so what is this layer taking into consideration? So we've got the walls in there. So should be a quick render if I render it without adding a cut. Do update full scene. I did hit snapshot as well, but not in enough time. So it would have been good to compare before and after, I guess. It's looking fine, I think. Actually, there's a lot of light, so that should be coming from the doorway. Ah, yeah, it's the wooden planks. It's kind of cool though, like getting these window lights in there. If we didn't have the planks of wood there, that would probably be more interesting. So we have the lights off, so we need to turn on the firelight and add the planks. So let's go back to our render setup. So I'm going to change the render layer. Because my scene's unorganized, I need to keep jumping back to this beauty render layer, master render layer, sorry, that's what it's called. And go to my primary viz collection, add these planks, and what else was it? Just take a look at my render. So add the planks and turn on the light, that's what it was. Yeah, so I'm going to save a snapshot this time. Where's my light editor? So with that open, and with my blacksmith room selected, can I right click it? Yes I can. Or let's see if I can middle mouse. I think there's two ways you could do it. So I could right click onto this. Or is it the collection? Right click. Anyway, I could just right click here, create absolute override for visible layer. So now it creates a collection of the lights. Self-enabled, tick it on. And this turns red, this eye, because you need to press it to run through an update. So now you can see in my light editor, the text is now turned orange and it's got a tick. Before we had this render set up, that's a way you would do it. Previously, there was another. I think you can still do it in the legacy Maya render layers, but all your render layers used to be in this bottom right hand side. So I think you can still do it that way if you're someone that used Maya a long time ago. Okay, so we might as well do another quick test render. Have I saved? Yep.
Moments later.
Okay, so that's re-rendered, and comparing to the beauty, looks pretty much the same. There's a slight difference. Mainly see the noise moving, but any other slight difference could just be from, you know, slight light bounces from other objects we have not added. So possibly the tankards, because they're not being affected, they're not being added, they're not being used in primary viz or anything like that, so they could be reflecting into here, but the difference is so minute that I don't really care about that. Did I snapshot that? Oh yeah, so that was the before and after. So we added the windows in and that turned on the light. So now we get all that noise. How wonderful. But looking at the plate, we're only going to see like this chunk. So all these walls on the on the right hand side we don't actually care about. Great. So now the background. Let's do the same but different. So I'm going to swap back to my master layer. Yeah, I'm just going to drag all of this. I would probably advise to break these things up more, but I'm just gonna separate this into one chunk. But you could, you know, have this. I think if I was using this for more of an actual serious project, I would at least consider separating the gate. So the gate on a layer, the barn on a layer, then this environment, this pathway, maybe that lump in the background on a separate layer. So I guess like 3 extra layers for the back, just so you can have everything nice and separated. Okay, so I've selected these objects. I think that's all fine. So create a new render layer. Just call it background group. Sorry, background layer. Right click, create collection, add the objects. Rename the collection. Backgrounds collection. So we've got those in. And you can guess what we're going to do next. Add another collection of, we'll just call it primary viz. Can't spell. Primary viz. So the shadow objects, which is probably just going to be these main walls. So I'm just going to add, what else? I think it should just be these walls. Well, we're going to do a test render anyway, so I'll just select the walls that I think are going to affect this area the most. So just 3 walls, and I need to just drag and drop primary viz from one of them. So go to my attribute editor, drag and drop. Oh, it was already turned off because it was turned off on the object that I happened to select. So when I changed the visibility to my background layer, this is what's in the scene. So I could probably do a test render. I'm going to open up the light editor and just check if that firelight is turned on or off. So it's turned off. I think when I made that initial adjustment to disable it, I might have done that on the master layer. So that's just something to be aware of. So you want to make sure you're on the, when you turn off or on a light, you want to make sure you're on that particular layer, because I must have been on the master layer and then right clicked and gone to create absolute override for visible layer and turned it off for that, for the master layer, which then has an effect with all these other layers. Cool, so I'm gonna just test render to see how the background layer is looking.
The next morning.
So this is the render, and as you can see, I've got these dots here, which that was my bad. So that's why it's good to do these test renders. These are the bolts or rivets, whatever, from the wood planks. So I just need to select them and then remove from my primary viz group outer wall. They're not actually there. Shapes. What is this called? Screws. Maybe, oh, I put it into my background collection. So that's why it would be ideal if everything was grouped. So this is what you will experience if you don't group things properly. So we could have grouped everything prior into, you know, like the background areas, and then it would just make this, even though the process isn't that slow, if your scene is very complicated, then it's going to go on for quite a while. Okay, so aside from that, I think the render was looking fine. Let's take a look again. So yeah, I've removed that. Let's compare the shadows to the master layer. There's no difference. So, oh wait, is there? Very, very slight. If you look at the light changing, but that could also be related to the, I'm not sure if the image plane in the scene was having an impact on the lighting. So but that's something to make note of as well. Okay, so we've got that, we've got these separate render layers. And what else? Oh yeah, something to keep in mind in the render editors. So we have these AOVs. So we've got 6, and then we turned on light groups for these two. So that's 6, and then these. Each of these is going to have 3, so there's going to be 9. So plus 6, so 15. So we've got 15 render layers for the master. And all of these render layers are going to be applied to these. So if you think about it, we've got 6, and then we added the light groups. So we added another 9, because there's going to be 3 passes for each of these. So 15, and then for each of these layers, because it has to calculate the beauty before it can calculate the other layers. So 15, and then 15, and then 15, and 15. So think about the render time as well. It's just going to be, yeah, it's going to cost you. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so what we'll do, so we've got all these layers, all the separate ones. We can create extra layers for, you know, IDs and things like that. In our AOVs, we do have, I realized I didn't actually add, we've got these crypto passes. These are essentially IDs. So you've got the object1 material. So these will create passes and assign a separate flat color related to the pass. So crypto object, every object will have a separate specific color, and then in Nuke you can use a crypto, is it a crypto ID node or something like that? Crypto material, that would be the shaders, you know, an asset, that would be, I think that's related to the UVs. I haven't used that in a while. There is another way if you want to create custom IDs, or I should call it the old way of doing it. So if we create a new render layer, so let's look at other passes we can make. So if we want to add fake shadows on top of our scene, we could create an ambient occlusion pass. So I'm just going to select all the objects in the scene apart from the background. This was the background plane that's meant for the depth of field. I'm going to sort of select all the objects and create a new render layer. So create collection. This collection will be called AO objects. Oops. Oh, I've deleted this side panel, so I just need to reset my workspace. Then go back to render settings. Cool. So now we have this. God damn it, I didn't actually add the objects. I created an empty collection. So I'm going to add these objects in, change to this render layer. So this is what we will have in the render. And now what I need to do is add a shader override. So let's go to I think it's right click. Oh yeah, right click on the collection. You've got create shader override, so we can hit that, and then we can add in the shader, so it's going to assign this to that collection. So in Arnold, I'm going to go to the ambient occlusion, and just gonna go render.
6.5 hours later.
So now that's rendered, you can see I've got my ambient occlusion. I would say we need to look at the walls. So these walls, I turned off primary visibility on my master layer, which is probably not a great idea, because now for every layer, if I want them on, then I need to manually turn them back on, rather than the other way, where it would be better just to turn them off. So to do that, I now need to put need to go to my render setup. Let's go to my objects. Because I want all these objects to be seen, I could just add primary vis to my whole collection, because it's fine, I just want to turn these objects on. So I've just dragged and dropped it just from a random object in there, and I'll turn it on. So now when I re-render, should be all fine. So the reason for that is we actually, although this wall is not going to be in the render, ambient occlusion is just calculated by other objects, you know, the distance of other objects. It creates shadowing. So if I zoomed in on, let's say, these planks, there's going to be a slight, yeah, although the most obvious bit of shadow is spilling onto the wall, but there will be a bit more shadow on the object. So yeah, that's just something to be aware of. Okay, so now we've got the ambient occlusion, so we could just merge and slightly multiply that onto our comp. What else? So ID. So let's say we just want to edit this object on its own, this these planks. So we could actually create a separate ID pass for this. But you've got you do have a crypto object and material. But if you want an even more basic pass to separate these objects with, we could just create a pass for this on its own. So I'm going to create a new render layer, just call it, actually I'll call it ID. So if we wanted these planks on their own, we could create a separate render layer, create a collection, and then just put these in and render them white. So that's very basic, and then we could just drop it straight into comp, use it, because then we'd have a pure black and white image. Actually, because this object's on its own, we wouldn't even need to put a new shader on it or anything, because it's separated, so you can use the alpha. But we can create an ID pass. So let's say we want a few different objects and we want them separated on their own. So I'm just going to pick some random objects. So let's do these planks. Create a collection. We're going to call this planks underscore red. So we're going to, for this ID, we're going to use pure colors. So red, green, and blue to give it to comp. So then they can let's say for some reason they want to specifically alter these 3 objects and they're not happy with all these crypto passes we've given to them. So we can create an ID this way. Just going to make sure these bolts are in there as well. Screws, whatever. So they're in there, great. Then I would create shader override. There are other ways to do this. This is just how I would do it. So what I want to do is add a shader, just a very flat one, so a surface shader. I'm going to name this surface shader red ID. In the out color, you see we've got these pure primary colors up there. I'm going to hit the red. So when I render this, cool, let's render, come on. At the moment we've only got this object in there, so we'd already have an alpha for it. So when I go to alpha, there's already a white, so we don't necessarily need the ID. But now we have a flat, pure, separate object. In fact, on the right hand side you can see I added another object, so that was my error. Don't even know what that is. Some more screws. There are screws on the far right hand of the screen. Okay, I'm going to change back to view my master layer and just add in a few other random objects. So let's create another collection, and let's say we want to separate this wall, so I add in the wall. Let's call it wall underscore background, or background wall. Actually, I'm going to add the color into the collection name, blue, so I've got the brick wall in there. Now I need to add the shader, create shader override. Let's go surface shader, rename it. So now blue ID, go to out color, blue. Cool, that's fine. And now I'll do the same with, to make it more interesting, let's do the blacksmith room. So blacksmith room underscore green. So I'm going to make all this blacksmith room green. Because this is just, for an example, I'm just sloppily grabbing everything, pretty much. The back wall. And all of this. Because it's a flat shader, we probably only needed to grab 2 of these walls. If we were trying to create a mat for just for the planks. Cool. I've added all those objects. In fact, I added this and I shouldn't have. I'm just going to delete that object. It's very pointless. Okay, so created the collection of the blacksmith room. Now same again. Shade override. Create. Go to Maya surface shader. Rename it. Green ID. Great. Now when we render this, we should have very colourful render. Okay, so you can now see that we have these IDs. This could be useful. It seems, I guess nowadays with the crypto mat, this seems a bit like an old school way of doing it. However, the screws in the wood were separated, so if we created a crypto object, we would still get 2 separate colours. If we created a crypto material, they have, I don't know, it's probably more work for comp, because if you've got so many things in your scene, these crypto materials, these crypto render passes will create so many separate things. So creating something like this might be requested, and it's pretty quick. The only thing I should mention is I was actually adding shader overrides. It should be material. The shader overrided everything, even though I applied, so the green one, the shader override overrided every object below it, which I didn't expect, to be honest. So with your collections, if you're creating an ID, I would say just right click on the collection and go to create material override, and then just add in your shader there. It's the same process. So in fact, this shader override, I could just delete that, and I've got my material override with the surface shader in there, which that just says the surface shader group name, but that's actually the red surface shader, as you can see there. So there's red, and because these are pure colors, then comp can actually isolate them very, very easily. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, just before you send off anything to batch render, we just need to remember that on our master layer, when we were looking at the different AOVs, so we created these AOVs or render passes, and we have 4, 5, 6, so we've got 6. But let's say we don't need them. So in our render layers, like, we don't need to render the beauty anymore, or the master layer, sorry. We've got the foreground, we've got the blacksmith room, which I guess would be like the midground, and then the background. So we probably want all these on there, but it's going to create a lot of passes. So we wouldn't need the Z for these passes actually. So what we can do if we want to turn off particular passes, so that the Z depth, we could actually create a separate pass for that, and we could just render it black because we just want that particular information. But let's say we want to turn it off for these passes, let's say. So we can go to our render settings, AOVs. With this layer visible, we can right click on the tick box and go create absolute override for visible. And is that actually, where is that? Okay, now it's added it. Oh, I added 2, whoops. Oh, sorry, it just added it there into this AOVs group. So I could delete one of them, and then I could just turn it off. So I just want to be, you just want to be aware as you're creating a layer, you might want to turn these off maybe when you first create the layer. So we've got this ambient one, that's ambient occlusion. I don't need, so I change my visibility to go to this layer, and you can see this tick turns back on. So for this ambient occlusion, I just need the beauty. So I can just right click on all of these. And turn them all off. That's just to avoid rendering unnecessary things, because it will add more time. We just want to be very careful, especially because we have the light groups turned on for 3 of these passes. So these 3 speculars are going to also render 3 separate renders themselves, because you've got the beauty, which is all the lights combined, then the firelight, and then the HDR. So for the so that's why we need to turn off the Z layer. I could probably remove that actually, but yeah, that's something to be aware of. Just remove any AOVs you don't need for different passes. Before rendering, I should just add that, so you could turn off your master beauty. Just make sure you've set the amount of frames you want in your render settings, and then you've got the change this to name, number, and then extension. and that you have your render camera and the correct resolution set up. So keep in mind, if there's something, if you need to see results fast, then you can, every single setting in the render settings, you can add an override. So if you want to see a quick dirty render, then, so by default, if you're viewing in the master layer and you change this to like 10, so that's going to apply for everything. But if you're on a render layer, so I'm on foreground, and let's say because this is the background layer, it could be crap looking, so, or not crap looking, but we don't need all the samples. So let's say the foreground, let's say it's really shiny, so we need more samples. So much like we were doing for everything else, but you would add absolute override for visible layer, and then change it. So any of these settings within here, the AOVs, if you want more, you can add more, and then you've got to turn them on and off for different layers. So I'm just making you aware that anything you see, you could just turn on. So if I want motion blur on just some of these layers, I could do that. Although for motion blur, yeah, I would say that's the sort of thing where you want it on or off completely, that sort of thing. But yeah, when it comes to rendering in the past, or depending on if you're using a different renderer, you hold down spacebar, go to render. When Maya used to have a different renderer called Mental Ray, we would do batch render, and then we would be able to open up the script editor and view our frames, kind of like a loading bar. Unfortunately, this does not work. So when if you're working from home, and you want to render, and you hit batch render, it will just come up with an error. In fact, I'll see what it does now. So when it comes to rendering, you can go to the rendering tab, go render, and then batch render here, and it will load your settings from the render setup as well as the general render settings tab, and it will start rendering your sequence. And then you can load up the script editor you can see here, so Windows, general editors, script editor, and you can see what's going on. If there are any errors, they will pop up, but it's telling you exactly what the computer is doing. I've noticed I didn't set my project, so this is being saved in the incorrect place. To set a project, you go File, Set Project, and pick the folder that you want to save it in. So I was saving to a folder in my desktop. So ideally, before you even do that, when you're creating a project, you would create project window, new, pick a location, and then you get all these pre-made folders. Once you do that, then you go File, Set, and that will overwrite. There's a small mail script in there. It will overwrite that. So when you do stuff like batch rendering, by default it should look in the images sequences, which is where this is going. If you want to cancel a render, you just go to the render tab, cancel batch render. If your batch render does not work, I'm surprised it was working today, because for previous projects I was getting an error. I can't even remember what it was. So I was under the belief that I couldn't batch render with Arnold on my home setup. So instead, I was doing a sequence render, because I get the same results from it. But I believe the sequence render takes a little bit more time, because it renders each frame in a small window. Also, you can't really monitor it as well. But if you want sequence render, the same rules apply. It pulls your render setup information and render settings, and then you turn on all render layers, render enabled layers. You pick your location, so it won't look for a location. So it's kind of good if you want to do it that way. And when you hit render and close, it will pop up another window, and as I just said, it will be a bit slower as well. So ideally you would just batch render things if you can. If you can't, this is like your backup solution. I think I used this as another workaround for, I can't remember if it was a different renderer, but I was guessing watermarks on, actually that was it. Okay, yeah, in the past I used render sequence because I think my renderer, whatever renderer I was using at the time, it might have been Arnold, might not have been, it was not properly licensed, or it thought this was the installation was broken. So when I was doing a batch render, it was giving me watermarks. So using render sequence actually gets around that because it was it was rendering each single frame and saving it. Whereas I guess the process for doing a batch render is different. So I'm going to check the frame that's just come out from this batch render, and if I get the watermark issue, then I can just render the sequence this way.